The cash register was untouched. The lights were still on. But the man behind the counter? Gone. And what K9 Salty found beneath the floorboard rewrote everything we thought we knew. 12 years ago, Brandon Ellis vanished during a quiet night shift at a rural Chevron station. They found his body hidden beneath a blanket. Stabbed 18 times. No fingerprints. No suspect. Just one thing left behind, blood that didn't belong to him. Now, a dog that's never failed a case just growled at a room sealed since 2012. And when he barked, the cold case exploded open. 12 years had passed since Brandon Ellis, a young gas station clerk and father of one, was found stabbed to death in that very room. No money was taken. No suspect was ever found. The case was shelved in 2013 and left to rot in the cold archives of Madison County. Until now. Salty had never been to this location before, yet his reaction was immediate, primal. He pulled hard on the leash as if he could sense the presence of a ghost. Nate stood quietly beside him, letting the dog lead. "Smell something, boy," he muttered, but he already knew the answer. Salty didn't bark. He didn't whine. He stared, into the shadows, into the silence, into a past that refused to stay buried. It was a Tuesday morning in Cedar Hills, Montana. The kind of town where gas stations close early, and folks still wave at each other from across the street. Nate had driven in from the state capital after being tapped to lead a new cold case task force funded by federal grants. And this was the case they handed him first. Brandon Ellis, 26, was working the night shift at the Chevron off Highway 287. He called his wife at 10:15 p.m., told her he loved her, and promised he'd be home for breakfast. When his coworker arrived at 6 a.m. the next morning, the front door was slightly open, lights still on, register untouched, and Brandon was missing. They found him an hour later in the back storage room, stabbed 18 times, his body hastily covered with a gray moving blanket. Nate had read the file 3 times on the drive-in, and each time it left him colder. No robbery. No forced entry. Wallet and watch still on the victim. And worst of all, blood at the scene that didn't match Brandon, but didn't match anyone else either. Cody's had returned nothing. The killer had no record. Until DNA tech caught up. Now, with advanced DNA separation and genetic genealogy, samples were being re-examined. And Nate had brought in Salty, a 6-year-old German Shepherd trained not just for narcotics and apprehension, but human scent recovery. He was the best partner Nate had ever had, and maybe the only one who could make sense of what everyone else had missed. Inside the abandoned station, dust clung to every surface like a stubborn memory. The cash register still sat on the counter, long since emptied. Faded snack wrappers peeked out from behind broken shelving. And that back room? It felt like time had paused, right at the moment Brandon took his last breath. Salty sniffed the doorway, then stepped carefully inside. His nose lowered to the ground. His tail stiffened. He moved toward the far right corner, past where Brandon's body had been found. That's when it happened. Salty let out a sharp bark and sat firmly in place, ears locked forward. He stared at a small tile near the baseboard, cracked and slightly lifted. "What is it, bud?" Nate crouched beside him and gently moved the tile. Underneath, wedged in the corner, was a single thread of dark blue fabric, no longer than a paperclip. Nate's heart skipped. The original report never mentioned this. It had been missed entirely. He placed the fabric in an evidence bag, marked it, and stood slowly. Salty remained still, eyes never leaving that corner. "You just found something they missed for 12 years, Nate whispered. Back at the Cedar Hills Police Department, Nate laid the evidence on the table in the forensics room. Lab techs were already working on reprocessing the blanket and water bottle found at the scene, both of which had traces of non-victim blood, but this thread? It was new. Potentially untouched by degradation. And while the lab did its job, Nate turned his focus to the victim. Brandon had been working 2 jobs, daytime handyman with his father-in-law, night clerk at Chevron, to support his wife Kayla and their 2-year-old son Jacob. He had no enemies. No criminal past. No secrets. Just a hard-working young man who took pride in simple things, family breakfasts, holding his son, and promising a future. And someone had ripped that future away. By Friday, the lab called Nate back. The thread? It tested positive for human blood, and not Brandon's. The DNA was clear. Clean. And entirely separate from the blanket and knife samples already being reanalyzed. 3 unknown DNA sources in one crime scene, and not a single match in the national system. Nate stood quietly in the hallway after the results were read. He looked down at Salty, who sat patiently by his feet. "You're not just sniffing ghosts, are you?" he said. "There's someone out there. Still breathing. Still walking around." Salty looked up and gently nudged his handler's hand with his nose. Nate had seen enough cases to know that sometimes, evil wore a perfectly ordinary face. A mechanic. A pastor. A neighbor who waved hello. This wasn't about street thugs or random violence. This was personal. Rage-filled. Deliberate. He reached for his keys. "Come on, partner," he said. "Let's go see if anyone remembers the man in the dark blue jacket." But as they drove back toward the Chevron station to canvass locals, something stirred in Nate's gut. The killer had never been caught. And what if he never left? The floor creaked under Officer Nate Granger's boots as he paced the narrow hallway of the Cedar Hills precinct. In one hand, he held the clear evidence bag. Inside it, the dark blue thread Salty had uncovered beneath a cracked tile in the Chevron storage room. The thread was so small, most would have missed it. But not Salty. Not the dog who'd solved 3 cases in the last 2 years, and never led Nate wrong. He stopped and looked down. Salty lay beside the desk, eyes alert but still, ears tuned to every sound like a radar dish. His tail gave a slight wag when Nate looked at him. "You found something real, didn't you, partner?" Nate whispered. The lab had already confirmed the blood on the thread wasn't Brandon Ellis's. That made 3 distinct DNA sources in the crime scene, Brandon's, an unknown male's on the blanket and knife handle, and now this, a separate unknown profile on the thread. That kind of contamination didn't happen by accident. Either more than one person was there that night, or the killer left behind more than anyone ever knew. Nate sat down with the original scene photos again, this time laying them out on a long wooden table in the evidence room. The images were grainy, taken in poor lighting, some with timestamp errors. Still, the details painted a brutal portrait. The back storage room was cluttered, narrow, barely enough space to swing a mop, let alone struggle for your life. Brandon's body had been found face down, partially covered by a gray wool blanket normally used to insulate winter supplies. Blood had pooled underneath him and splattered the nearby wall. The stabbing had been violent, relentless. But what caught Nate's attention now were the footprints, faint but visible in some of the wider shots. He leaned in closer, pulling a magnifier across one photo. Brandon's shoes had been documented. Soft rubber soles, size 9. The impressions in the photo were larger. Size 11, maybe 12. And they had a distinct heel ridge pattern, the kind found on heavy work boots. Yet the original report had dismissed them as inconclusive. Nate made a note, get prints reanalyzed. Compare to Elwood lead. Then his eyes shifted to Salty, who had gotten up and was sniffing near the windowsill where the evidence photos lay scattered. He stopped, nose hovering over a printed inventory log. Nate picked it up. It was the Chevron supply report for November 2012. One entry stood out. Maintenance check, heater unit /signed, M. Elwood. It had been entered 3 days before the murder. Nate's eyebrows lifted. The name hadn't shown up in the initial witness list. He dug deeper and found a second reference to a Mark Elwood, contracted tech. Whoever he was, he'd been near the scene just days before the murder. That afternoon, Nate drove Salty out to the back fields behind the Chevron station. The overgrown grass had swallowed the old drainage path where deliveries used to come through. Salty trotted quietly alongside Nate, nose lowered, ears perked. They circled the rear of the building. Salty stopped suddenly, sniffed hard at the soil, then turned sharply and followed a short overgrown trail toward the edge of the tree line. There, half buried in mud and leaves, Salty stopped again, this time more alert. He barked once. Nate followed his gaze. Something was glinting beneath the foliage. He knelt down and brushed away the damp debris. His gloved hand wrapped around a plastic water bottle, faded and sun-worn but intact. Around the rim, faint red smudges. Inside, a few dried remnants of liquid. Nate sealed it in a fresh bag, labeled the location, and scratched the back of his neck. If this had been there all these years, why hadn't anyone found it? Or more importantly, who dropped it? By the time he returned to the lab, the first round of DNA processing on the water bottle had already started. Nate paced outside the forensics wing, arms crossed, mind racing. The DNA from the blanket and the thread hadn't matched any known profile in the national database. But this? This could be the piece that tied them together. While the lab ran its machines, Nate reviewed the old list of interviewees. There were only a few. Most were co-workers, Brandon's wife Kayla, and one elderly couple who lived across the road from the station. They'd reported hearing metal clanging and a short yell around midnight the night Brandon was killed. That had loosely matched the coroner's estimated time of death. But they also mentioned something else, something that got buried in the file. Their dog had barked furiously for several minutes that night, pacing by the back door and whining before going quiet. Most dismissed it. Nate didn't. Salty had that same intensity when something was wrong. Dogs remembered. They reacted to things we couldn't see. What if that dog had heard the killer fleeing? The lab called him back by evening. The blood on the bottle matched the unknown male DNA from the blanket. It was the same person. Now they had two physical locations, the back room and the backwoods, both tied to the same DNA. A clear trail of evidence. Still no match in Cody's. But the consistency? That was gold. Nate didn't waste a second. He requested permission to send all existing DNA to a specialized forensic genealogy lab in California. The request was approved by morning. That night, Nate stopped by the Ellis home. Kayla answered the door, older now but still carrying a heaviness in her eyes. Her teenage son, Jacob, peeked out from the hallway. "Officer Granger," she said, surprised. "I just wanted to give you an update," Nate said, his voice soft. "We're closer than ever. I can't give details yet, but we're moving forward." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She only nodded and stepped aside. Salty sat beside Nate, tail thumping lightly as Jacob approached. "Is that him?" the boy asked. "Yeah," Nate smiled. "This is Salty. He's the best partner I've got." Jacob crouched and scratched the dog gently behind the ears. "He's gonna catch the guy." Nate swallowed, then nodded. "He's already started." On the drive back, the town of Cedar Hills was quiet. The mountains were silhouetted in deep blue as the sun set behind them. Salty curled up in the passenger seat, eyes half closed, but alert as ever. Nate glanced at the GPS. Next stop, the address of Mark Elwood. The man who once signed the maintenance log. The man who may never have left town. Officer Nate Granger had seen his fair share of long shots. Cold cases. Forgotten victims. Crime scenes left to collect dust and decay. But none of them had a K9 like Salty. And Salty, he wasn't letting go. It was just after 8 a.m. when Nate parked the cruiser outside the Cedar Hills station. Salty sat alert in the back seat, eyes locked on the passenger mirror, as if his mind were still in that back storage room of the abandoned Chevron. Like he could smell something the rest of the world had missed for over a decade. Nate walked into the records division and nodded to Marcia at the desk. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You still chasing ghosts, Granger?" "No," Nate replied. "I've got a blood trail. Just need to find where it starts." Inside a small conference room, a crime scene board stretched across 2 walls. Nate had pinned the recovered photos from 2012, crime scene shots, autopsy notes, interviews, and a single blurry frame from the station's outdated surveillance system. A shadowed figure behind the Chevron. Grainy. Faint. But clearly human. It was a still pulled from footage taken around 11:20 p.m., just minutes before Brandon Ellis was presumed murdered. The timestamp matched the time a trucker named Carl Peterson claimed he saw a guy in a dark jacket standing near the storage room door. And now, 12 years later, that blurry figure was the only visual they had of the killer. Nate leaned closer to the screen, zooming in. The footage was poor quality, but he noticed something new, a slight shift in the man's gait. A favoring of one side. Subtle. But enough. "He had a limp," Nate whispered. "Left side." Later that afternoon, Nate met Salty outside the evidence room. A technician handed him a sealed plastic bag. The contents were unassuming, a torn strip of fabric, dark navy, faded with age. It had been retrieved from under a cracked tile near where Brandon's body had been found. Salty had sniffed it out himself. Nate brought it to the light. Along the edge, faint stitching, the kind used in work uniforms. A tag was barely visible, the ink smeared, but the text had enhanced it, RCM maint. That meant nothing to the average person. But to Nate, it set off a mental spark. Rocky Creek Maintenance. A subcontractor service that used to handle farm equipment in the surrounding counties. Nate returned to the Chevron station the next morning with Salty. This time, they walked the exterior, circling the building like it was still an active crime scene. Salty moved with purpose, nose close to the dirt, occasionally pausing at specific spots near the old dumpster and fence line. Then, just past the utility meters behind the building, Salty stopped cold. He began sniffing around a pile of debris, old pallets, leaves, and tangled plastic. That's when Nate saw it. A rusted bolt, still lodged in concrete. Beside it, half buried under mud and years of rain, was a plastic wrapper from a maintenance work order. Nate pulled it out gently with gloved hands. Though water-damaged, a few lines were still legible. November 10, 2012, HVAC assessment, site, CH, 287, Chevron, technician, M.L. The name was smudged. The last few letters unreadable. But now, Nate had a first initial, a location match, and a 2-day window before the murder. Back at the station, Nate and Salty reviewed the original interview files again, looking for anything or anyone that might have slipped through the cracks. 3 suspects had been ruled out in 2012, a trucker with a motel alibi, a fired coworker, and a local drifter. None had matched the DNA. But none of them had worked for Rocky Creek Maintenance either. Nate called the company. It was now defunct, shut down in 2015 after filing for bankruptcy. But through old county contractor records, he found a list of employees from that era. One name stood out, Mark Elwood. Born 1970. Lived in Twin Pines, just outside of Idaho Falls. Listed as a field technician from 2010 to 2013. And the most important detail? He walked with a limp from a farm accident in the late 90s. Nate stared at the name. It was just a name on paper, but Salty's instincts didn't care about paper. They cared about scent. About truth. He pulled out the recovered crime scene footage again. Slowed it down. Frame by frame. The figure's left leg stiffened ever so slightly with each step. Just like Elwood's medical report had described. It was time to get a DNA sample. But not through a warrant, not yet. Nate opted for a legal trash pull. If Elwood's current address was correct, they could collect anything discarded, cigarette butts, tissues, coffee cups, and run DNA without ever setting foot inside his home. At 3:15 a.m., under the cover of darkness, Nate and a forensics tech drove to the address listed on Elwood's last DMV update. An old silver pickup was parked out front. Trash bins were at the curb. Salty sat quietly in the back of the unmarked vehicle, watching, waiting. As the tech retrieved the bags, Salty gave a single, low growl. "Same scent?" Nate asked. Salty didn't answer with a bark, but he pressed his nose against the window as if to say, yes. Him. 2 days later, the lab called. The results were clear. The cigarette butt collected from the trash was a match to the blood found on the blanket covering Brandon Ellis's body 12 years earlier. Mark Elwood had been there. He'd bled there. And now, for the first time in 4,380 days, this case had a name attached to the DNA. But Nate didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because if Elwood had gone this long without being caught, there was one thing he knew for sure. He wouldn't go down easy. Nate Granger had stared down a lot of bad guys in his 15 years of law enforcement, burglars, domestic abusers, junkies, liars, but there was something uniquely frustrating about a shadow with no name. And that's what this case had become. A perfect DNA match to no one. No hits in Cody's. No criminal history. No arrest. No known fingerprints. Just a blood sample from a broken blade and a blanket, now confirmed by the lab, and nothing else. If the killer had never been caught before, he wasn't in any system. And if he'd never spoken of his crime, he could be walking around town like an average Joe, fixing fences, coaching Little League, shaking hands at church. That's what chilled Nate the most. It was early morning when Nate pulled into the Cedar Hills Town Archive, a small red brick building tucked between the library and the volunteer fire department. He wasn't looking for anything dramatic, just names. Maintenance workers. Janitors. Vendors. Anyone who had a reason to be at the old Chevron station around the time Brandon Ellis was murdered. He sifted through old city contracts, vendor logs, and supply schedules until one thing popped out. A maintenance invoice dated November 5, 2012, just a week before Brandon was killed. Company name, Elwood Mechanical Services. Employee on duty, Mark Elwood. No criminal record. No arrest history. Just a guy who fixed broken HVAC systems and changed oil filters. But something about the name made Nate pause. It matched the old notation Salty had uncovered, a smudged name on the back of an outdated maintenance log from the Chevron storage cabinet. Until now, it had been dismissed as illegible. But there it was, M. Elwood. That afternoon, Nate took a quiet drive down to Pine Hollow Drive, a modest cul-de-sac just outside of town where Mark Elwood still lived. He didn't knock. Not yet. Instead, he parked down the block, windows slightly cracked. Salty lay in the back seat, eyes wide open, tracking every movement like a sentry. Mark Elwood exited his house around 4:15 p.m., dressed in grease-stained jeans and a flannel jacket, carrying a beat-up toolbox. He loaded it into a silver Chevy pickup, exactly like the one mentioned in a forgotten witness report from 2012. A truck seen leaving the Chevron station minutes after the lights went out. Elwood looked ordinary. But then again, they always did. Nate took a photo from the dash cam and pulled away without being noticed. Back at the station, the cold case team got to work. They filed for a trash pull warrant, a legal method to collect discarded items from a public trash bin. Once approved, 2 detectives waited until garbage day and recovered a torn garbage bag left on the curb outside Elwood's home. Inside were several used tissues, a fast food straw, and 3 cigarette butts. All of them were sealed, logged, and sent straight to the forensic lab in Helena. Meanwhile, Nate requested Elwood's employment history. The file confirmed he had worked throughout Cedar Hills and the neighboring counties from 2010 to 2013, including routine assignments in Rexland Township, where the Chevron station once stood. That was enough to tighten the net. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later. Full match. The blood found on the knife and blanket in 2012 was now 100% confirmed to belong to Mark Elwood. Nate stood in the lab, staring at the report. No more shadows. No more guesses. They had him. But Nate knew better than to kick down the door and call it done. DNA may solve a case in the public's eye, but in court, you needed the full story, timeline, motive, connection, behavior, background. He needed to understand why. So he spent the next few days retracing everything about Mark Elwood's life. His divorce in the late 90s. A couple of bar fights. Nothing violent enough to raise red flags. But in every reference, from his ex-wife to old co-workers, the same words came up. Mark had a temper. He was quiet most days, but if you pushed him, man, he snapped. One time he screamed at a gas station clerk for shortchanging him. That guy looked terrified. It wasn't hard to imagine Brandon Ellis, working the night shift, maybe telling Mark the pump was broken or refusing to sell beer after hours, being on the receiving end of that temper. And it wasn't hard to imagine how fast that temper could become fatal. Nate returned home that evening, exhausted. He opened the door to find Salty sitting patiently by the fireplace, tail thumping once in acknowledgement. "You were right all along," Nate said, rubbing behind Salty's ears. "You sniffed him out before the lab ever did." He pulled up Elwood's file again and scrolled through every report, every witness interview. And then he saw it. An old note from the original case file, one the previous detective had scribbled in the margin but never followed up on. Elderly couple on Crosswind Lane heard yelling and metal clanging around midnight. Dog barked for 10 minutes. Never looked into it. Nate's blood ran cold. Crosswind Lane was just 1 block behind the Chevron. And Mark Elwood had lived there from 2010 to 2013, before moving to Pine Hollow. He hadn't just been near the crime scene. He had walked home from it. The next morning, Nate presented everything to the county prosecutor. Timeline. DNA. Witness statements. Behavioral reports. Geographic proximity. By noon, the arrest warrant was signed. Nate stood quietly in the locker room, pulling on his vest while Salty sat beside his boots. The station buzzed with tension. Officers prepped the squad cars. SWAT was on standby, just in case. Elwood legally owned a shotgun and a handgun, registered in his name. Nate bent down to fasten Salty's K9 harness. He whispered softly, "Let's bring him in, boy. It's time." Salty didn't bark. He just stared at the door, ready. The morning fog clung to the streets of Idaho Falls like a ghost that refused to lift. Officer Nate Granger sat behind the wheel of his unmarked cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee, eyes locked on the modest 2-story home across the street. Next to him, Salty sat alert in the passenger seat, ears perked, eyes fixed. Inside that house was Mark Elwood, the man whose DNA had just matched the mystery blood found on the blanket that had once covered Brandon Ellis's body. Nate's heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. It had taken 12 years to get here. 12 years of silence, pain, and unanswered questions. And now? Now, the answers were beginning to breathe. For weeks, Nate and the cold case unit had conducted quiet surveillance. No press. No raids. Just long hours, legal trash pulls, and waiting. Elwood wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a mechanic, a churchgoer, a family man. A man who grilled burgers in his backyard on Sundays and coached his son's little league team. But under that suburban routine was something darker. Something that bled through cracks, like the jacket. It started with a simple trash run. One night, after Elwood took out his garbage, detectives retrieved a cigarette butt and a to-go cup from the bin. DNA from the saliva on the cup was sent to the lab in California. And what came back? A full match. It was his blood on the blanket. His DNA at the murder scene. And suddenly, everything that seemed normal about Mark Elwood didn't. With that match confirmed, the judge signed off on the search warrant. Nate rode in the lead vehicle as the team approached Elwood's property just after dawn. No sirens. No shouting. Just quiet movement. Tactical. Controlled. Safe. "Let's keep it clean," Nate had said during the briefing. "We're not here for a takedown. We're here for the truth." Inside the house, Elwood was cooperative. A little too cooperative. His voice calm. His face unreadable. He didn't ask why they were there. He already knew. While the team secured the rooms, Nate and Salty were granted access to the garage and attic. The garage was spotless. Tools neatly aligned on a pegboard. Old oil-stained rags tucked in a red bin. Nothing stood out. But in the attic? Salty stopped cold at a battered plastic storage tub, its lid warped from years of sun exposure. He sniffed it once, then barked. Short, sharp. Then again. Nate popped the lid. Inside, folded beneath a stack of moth-eaten blankets and rusted metal parts, was a dark blue work jacket, the same kind described by witnesses at the crime scene in 2012. Salty let out a low growl. Nate reached for his gloves. Back at the evidence lab, technicians laid the jacket out under UV light. Faint stains lined the cuffs and right pocket. To the naked eye, it looked like dirt. But under UV? Blood. It had soaked into the fibers. Not in large pools, but in tiny splatters. The kind you only get when someone swings a blade again, and again. Swabs confirmed it. The blood was Brandon Ellis's. Nate stood silently as the results came in, staring at the jacket on the stainless steel table. It was more than fabric. It was a time machine, a piece of the past finally speaking. Then came the knife. Buried beneath old boxes in the same bin, the forensic team recovered a folding utility knife with a cracked black handle and rust along the edge. It wasn't just any knife. It matched the break pattern of the blade found at the crime scene in 2012, the one that had snapped 2 meters away from Brandon's body. The blade still carried traces of blood, 2 types. One matched Brandon. The other? Mark Elwood. The killer had cut himself that night. And this knife had kept the secret for 12 years. But there was more. Beneath the jacket and knife was a small leather-bound journal. At first glance, it was filled with notes on engine repairs and to-do lists, perfectly ordinary. But on one torn page near the center, Nate found the words that froze him in place. "Some things can't be washed clean. I left too many traces. No names. No dates. Just guilt." Nate showed the journal to the forensic handwriting analyst, who confirmed the match. It was Elwood's. The case was no longer circumstantial. It wasn't theory. It was fact. That night, Nate sat at his desk with Salty lying by his feet, quietly chewing on a rope toy. The walls of the cold case unit were lined with evidence boards, timeline charts, and the photos they used to keep the story straight. But now? They didn't need boards. Or theories. Or guesses. They had the jacket with Brandon's blood. They had the knife with DNA from both victim and suspect. They had the journal, which read like a whisper from the past. And they had Salty, the one who had sniffed out the crack in the floor, the broken tile, the plastic tub that time had tried to bury. Nate leaned down and scratched behind Salty's ears. "Couldn't have done it without you, partner," he whispered. Salty wagged his tail and looked up, eyes calm and steady. Justice wasn't complete yet, but it was closer than ever. The next step would be the hardest, bringing Mark Elwood into the interrogation room and watching him face what he tried to outrun for over a decade. But one thing was certain. He couldn't outrun DNA. He couldn't outrun the truth. And he damn sure couldn't outrun Salty. Mark Elwood sat in the interrogation room like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. His hands were clasped tight on the steel table. His eyes scanned the bland beige walls, the fluorescent lights above, the clock ticking louder with each second. But what got to him more than anything was the dog. K9 Salty sat quietly in the corner of the room, ears forward, posture stiff. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared, unblinking, focused, as if he could smell the truth bleeding off Elwood's skin. And in a way, he could. Officer Nate Granger stood by the door, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. It had taken 12 years, but they were finally here. And the evidence, the real, physical proof, was irrefutable. Still, a confession would seal it. Earlier that morning, Nate and Salty had reviewed the final forensic reports in silence. The DNA on the knife, the jacket, and the coffee cup matched. Not just to each other, but directly to the blood found at the crime scene. The journal recovered from Elwood's attic, handwriting confirmed, pages torn, and one line circled in red. Some things can't be washed clean. That was enough for a warrant. Enough for the prosecutor. But Nate knew, the moment they confronted Elwood would either shatter his lies, or give him one last chance to slither out. So they didn't charge him immediately. Not yet. Instead, they invited him down to the Cedar Hills Police Department for a conversation. Ellison arrived wearing a checkered shirt, clean jeans, and that hollow, almost too normal expression. He nodded politely, even smiled. But Nate could see it, the weight he carried, just beneath the surface. And now, in this room, that weight was finally starting to crush him. Detective Marlene Castillo, Nate's longtime colleague, began the questioning. "So Mark," she said casually, "tell us again, where were you on the night of November 10, 2012? Elwood cleared his throat. "At home. I was home with my wife and kids. Watched a little TV, went to bed early. No work that day. Just routine maintenance out on the North Fields, done by 5. Nate stepped forward, dropping a printed cell tower report on the table. "Your phone pinged a tower just 3 miles from the Chevron station, at 11:17 p.m. that night." Elwood frowned. "Could have been in the truck. Maybe I drove past. Doesn't prove anything." Marlene slid a new photo across the table. A dark blue jacket, laid flat, lit by UV light. The caption read, "Blood trace confirmed, victim, Brandon Ellis." "That jacket was found in a box in your attic," she said. "Still had his blood on it. We also found your knife, with both your blood and his." Elwood's breath caught for half a second, then steadied. "I don't know how that got there." "You don't know how a murder victim's blood ended up on your clothes in your attic?" Nate asked, voice calm but firm. Silence. Then Nate dropped the final photo. A close-up of a coffee cup, rim stained. DNA analysis printed on the side. Full match, stamped in red. "This cup," Nate said, "from the cafe last week. The DNA matches the blood found at the crime scene, and nowhere else in the entire national database." Elwood's lips parted. Then closed. He looked at Salty, still motionless, still staring. Then back at the table. "You want to explain all of this, Mark?" Marlene asked. I don't know what you're trying to pin on me," he muttered. Nate leaned in. You stabbed Brandon Ellis 18 times. You covered his body with a blanket. You left your blood at the scene. You made mistakes, Mark. And now, your past is staring you in the face. Elwood flinched. I didn't do it, he whispered. You're wrong. But then, the cracks began to show. His fingers twitched. Sweat beaded at his temple. His shoulders sagged ever so slightly. Maybe I stopped in, he said suddenly. I might have gone in to grab something. Maybe I cut my hand. I don't know. It was a long time ago. You went into a closed gas station at midnight and bled on a man's body by accident? Nate said, deadpan. Elwood's eyes darted. I didn't kill him. I swear to God. Then how did your DNA get on the blanket covering his corpse? Silence. How did your blood end up on the murder weapon? Silence. Why did your jacket, locked in your attic, test positive for Brandon's blood? His voice cracked. I didn't mean to, he stopped himself, jaw tight. Marlene's eyes narrowed. You didn't mean to what? Elwood looked away. I didn't plan it. It was barely audible. But it was enough. Nate noted every word, every flinch. He didn't need a full confession. The evidence was already screaming. When the interrogation ended, Elwood was released under surveillance. Nate didn't need to arrest him yet, they had everything lined up for the final takedown. Outside the station, Nate let Salty out of the patrol vehicle and walked him across the parking lot. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows against the walls of the department. Salty sniffed the air and gave a single sharp bark. You knew the truth before we did, Nate said, scratching behind his ears. You always do. That evening, the final evidence reports were handed off to the county prosecutor. The blood. The knife. The jacket. The journal. The photos. The timeline. The motive, rage, perhaps rejection, perhaps nothing more than a man losing control. And the dog. Salty. In the final report, his name appeared not once, but 5 times, every clue, every location, every breakthrough tied directly to his instincts. For 12 years, the killer thought he had buried the truth. But one dog dug it back up. The courthouse was packed. Not just with reporters and officials, but with neighbors, grocery clerks, retired teachers, truckers, and ranchers, people who remembered Brandon Ellis, even if only vaguely. He was the kind of man you didn't notice until he was gone. The kind of man who held open doors, returned change when you overpaid, and clocked in without complaint. Officer Nate Granger stood near the back of the room, not in uniform. Salty was by his side, calm but alert, wearing a fresh black vest with a bright yellow, K9 unit, patch. It had been 12 years since Brandon's murder. And now, the man who once smiled and waved across church pews, the man who walked his kids to school, fixed fences for elderly neighbors, and even volunteered at a food drive, was sitting at the front of the courtroom, wrists cuffed, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Mark Elwood. Nate watched him closely, remembering how Salty had growled the second they passed the old Chevron's back room. How that growl had cracked open a frozen case and set everything in motion. It wasn't a coincidence. It was instinct. Salty knew something the rest of them had forgotten to feel. Elwood hadn't confessed. Not exactly. But he didn't have to. Between the jacket soaked in Brandon's blood, the folding knife with DNA from both men, and the crumpled journal with its cryptic regrets, there wasn't much room for denial. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece. The motive was never entirely clear, maybe resentment, maybe a failed confrontation, maybe something darker and unresolved, but the evidence didn't lie. Especially not the blood evidence that had sat in cold storage for over a decade, waiting for science to catch up and a dog to bark. Salty had done what humans couldn't. He found what was missing. He gave a silent victim his voice back. Kayla, Brandon's widow, sat in the front row, clutching a tissue in one hand and the hand of her now teenage son, Jacob, in the other. Jacob was taller than she was now, face lean with maturity, but his eyes still carried that familiar ache, the ache of someone whose father never came home for breakfast. When Kayla took the stand, the room fell to a hush. She didn't shake. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke softly and plainly, but every word landed like a hammer. "He didn't deserve to die like that," she said. "My husband went to work that night like he always did. He was tired. He was overworked. But he never skipped a shift. He never missed a goodnight call. And he never broke a promise. Until that night, when someone else broke everything." She glanced at Elwood. He didn't look up. Jacob spoke next. His voice was clear, strong, rehearsed. "I never got to know my dad. I grew up with a picture, not a person. But I know this, he was a good man. And he should still be here." You could hear people crying softly in the gallery. Some tried to hide it. Others didn't bother. The jury's decision didn't take long. They didn't need deliberation marathons or dramatic debates. The evidence had already spoken, loud, undeniable, and final. Nate didn't blink when the verdict was read. He kept his hand gently on Salty's back. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't bark, didn't whine. He just watched Elwood, eyes locked, steady and unblinking. As if he understood the meaning of closure. Afterward, outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Kayla declined to speak, but when she saw Nate, she walked over without a word and hugged him. Not tightly. Not tearfully. Just long enough to say something without saying anything at all. Jacob knelt down to Salty's level, brushing the dog's fur gently. "You found him," he said. Salty licked his hand once and sat tall. Nate smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's good at that." That evening, Nate drove out to the old Chevron station. It had long since closed, boarded up, graffiti tagged, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. But someone had left a small wooden cross where the back door used to be, decorated with artificial flowers and a laminated photo of Brandon. Nate parked a few yards away and stepped out with Salty. The air was still. Quiet. A breeze stirred the tall grass. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance. Salty trotted ahead and sat by the cross, ears perked. Not alert. Not on guard. Just, present. Nate joined him, crouching down beside the dog. "You did good, partner," he whispered. "You brought him home." Salty looked up and rested his head against Nate's knee. They stayed like that for a while, man and dog, in silence, in memory, in the kind of peace that only comes after the storm has passed. That night, back at the station, Nate filed the last of his paperwork. Evidence sealed. Report submitted. Chain of custody documented. Another case closed, but this one felt different. Not because it had taken so long. Not because the killer had lived among them for so many years. But because it almost hadn't been solved at all. If Salty hadn't growled at that room, if that tile hadn't cracked just right, if that thread hadn't been found. It made Nate wonder how many more cold cases were waiting quietly in boxes. How many families still lit candles each year with no answers. And how many of those answers were waiting for the right moment, the right investigator, the right dog. He looked at Salty curled up in his bed near the corner of the office. The dog's breathing was slow, steady. Content. "Good night, hero," Nate said. "Thank you for following this story." After 13 years, justice was finally served, not just by evidence, but by instinct, persistence, and a four-legged partner who never gave up. What would you do if your dog led you to a secret no one else could see? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. We'll see you next time.